First of all, thank you, of course, for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. My intervention will take the form of a few brief comments on my reading of Dr. Stavrakakis' text, which will inevitably include more questions than answers, as this material offers copious amounts of food for thought. In this way, I think the books discussed here today, and all of the articles as well, faithfully comply with what Zizek has deemed the philosopher's task, which is to shift the ideological framework within which we perceive a problem. Dr. Stavrakakis' work provides an insightful and valuable means of connecting Lacanian theory and democracy. In both, he says, we must embrace and acknowledge our limits, our inability to capture the real. Furthermore, it is necessary to repeatedly inscribe the limits of this theoretical discourse within its own symbolic fabric, in this way allowing the formulation of an ethics of theorizing situated within its own broader political background, that is, of a democratic revolution. This knowledge of the constitutive lack around which the social is constructed provides the basis for an opening to a radicalization of democracy. But as Dr. Stavrakakis points out in his introduction to the Lacanian left, knowledge in general is never adequate. Something always escapes. This phrase, something always escapes, of course, provides me a nice segue into an area that I'd like to address today, that being the concept of a post-hegemonic perspective. Since the publication of Post-Hegemony in 2010, Something Always Escapes has become somewhat of a calling card or signature for John Beasley Murray, the book's author. Beasley Murray, along with Scott Lash and Richard Day, have been referred to by Dr. Stavrakakis as the Avengers of the Real, due to the manner in which their projects highlight the ways in which power operates directly and exclusively on a biopolitical affective real, where, according to these theorists, one can theorize non-hegemonic mechanisms of domination. These approaches have been heavily critiqued by Dr. Stavrakakis, who sees in them an explicit lack of engagement with Foucault's long dialogue with psychoanalytic theory. More specifically, he sees in post-hegemonic theories an overdetermination toward repressing both representation and discourse, which thus forces a conceptualization of social structure based upon affective embodied practices. According to Stavrakakis, Beasley Murray and others fail to account for the inevitable return of these repressed tenets of hegemony theory, and so instead of effectively doing away with Foucault's formulation and supplanting it with a post-hegemonic one, we are left with what can instead be thought of as an affective theory of hegemony. I had originally planned on asking Professor Stavrakakis for his take on the place of Lacanian theory within a paradigm or perspective of post-hegemonic thinking, but after reading his article that deconstructs these approaches, I think I know where he stands on the issue. I'm still interested, however, in this so-called affective turn and its relationship to psychosocial theory. Both psychoanalysis and theories of affect, after all, recognize the potential of embodied experiences, those that happen beneath consciousness, and both perhaps open up space for a discussion of infrapolitics, those that remain just beneath the threshold of the political. I'm hoping also that Professor Stavrakakis could elaborate on this link, and perhaps also on another section of the same article I've been citing, where in his final remarks, he concludes that the various post-hegemonic critics discuss, quote, fail to account for the irreducible links between these horizontal practices and hegemonic politics, visible in many contemporary examples. I'm wondering if Professor Stavrakakis could expand upon what these examples might be, especially concerning a Latin American context, which you started to do in your presentation, which he has described as perhaps the only place outside of Europe where leftist projects have continued to maintain some sort of prominence. Around here, we've been giving a lot of attention to the Bolivian case, so it was on my mind as I read through the text. And I was particularly drawn to one coincidence of terms. If I may bring up post-hegemony once again, it's during Stavrakakis' critique of Scott Lash, in which we read that, quote, the real of post-hegemonic power tends to overlap with Spinoza's potentia, force, energy, potential, end of quote. The possible connection worth noting here is perhaps between this kernel of post-hegemonic theory and the Bolivian case is the word itself, potentia, which also constitutes the title of Bolivian Vice President Alberto Garcia Linero's book, Potencia Plebeya, which acts as somewhat of a theoretical political manifesto of the plurinational state that the Morales-Garcia Linero leadership reports. One can argue whether or not the popular indigenous sectors of Bolivia act in non-hegemonic as opposed to counter-hegemonic ways, But what may be useful here is to think about the relationship between this power and affective theories of hegemony, a power that constitutes, that, quote, constitutes us from the inside, and the revolutionary movements or moments that have occurred in Bolivia over the past 10 to 15 years. How can we make sense of these movements, and how is a psychosocial critique implicated within this context? Is this purported plurinationality in the Bolivian case another form of an ethics of harmony, or the politics of utopia that has long stood as a barrier to the political and theoretical aspirations of the left? Or does it act as a means to pursue a radically democratic course? Or, as Alberto mentioned, is it perhaps a form of radical communitarianism? Lacan himself seemed rather disillusioned with the political possibilities of social movements when, while speaking to a group of students in 1969, he said, quote, "Revolutionary aspirations have only one possibility, always to end up in the discourse of the master. Experience has proven this. What you aspire to as revolutionaries is a master." End of quote. Professor Stavrakakis is perhaps not quite as cynical when he writes that all such struggles are not necessarily bound to, sooner or later, acquire hegemonic form. But when they don't, he says, it's at least likely that this will set limits to the future prospects of these movements. And he brings up the Occupy movement as an example. The options then, it seems, are either to be a counter-hegemonic force that, in the most successful scenario, merely turns the tables without freeing itself from this destructive game, or to be a limited player incapable of effecting real change. In this scenario, the question would be then, where can we find the space for radical democracy? Now I'm there. Thank you.